What's up, guys? It's Nick here with Visualicity. I found something pretty interesting and I wanted to share it with you guys. I was doing some digging inside of the Xtheme files and I stumbled on the utility class's source file. Now, before I go over what I found, I want to quickly explain what helper or utility classes are. So if you already know, feel free to just skip ahead to the time that should be popping up in the video right about now. And for all those who didn't skip, congratulations, you also get to see our fun fact, which is my way of saying thank you for not skipping ahead. Moving on. Xtheme ships with a list of helper classes, which are small class strings that were previously declared by the developers inside the code that output a CSS style to the element that you attach them to without you actually having to type out the CSS code. All you have to do as the user is know what the helper class is and type it into the little class box on Cornerstone. Using these helper classes is a huge time saver when it comes to styling your elements. Okay, so as I was saying, I opened up the code files for the helper classes, and I've been using these classes for a while, but after studying the codes I noticed that there was a lot to the helper classes that I didn't really know about. Not to mention, I also found a couple of helper classes that weren't even in ThemeCode's knowledge base at all, despite them still being very useful. Now, there is a good chance that they aren't displayed on the knowledge base because they're meant for Xtheme to use internally rather than us to use while customizing our pages on Cornerstone. But they still do work in Cornerstone, and I've used them a lot after I've discovered them. In this video, we're going to start off by talking about the basic spacing and typography helper classes, and then eventually we'll move on to the more complicated helper classes and go over what their CSS codes do, and how we can use them on our sites, of course. Anyways, guys, thanks again for watching. Please subscribe for more, and enjoy. To start off, I want to talk about the simple but extremely useful spacing helper classes. This does look a little daunting at first, but I promise it's actually pretty easy to remember. You just need to keep in mind that all spacing helpers have 3 letters. The first letter will always control the margin or padding. The second letter will control which side of the element you're selecting. And the third letter will always control the size of the spacing that you want to create or get rid of. So the first letter is always going to be either M or P for margin or padding. The second letter will be which side, so if it's top, it'll be T, left L, right R, B bottom. If you use V, that'll be the vertical side, so top and bottom. H will be the horizontal sides, which is left and right, and all will be all of them. The third letter is spacing. When you're adding your spacing, it's important to keep in mind that the spacing isn't going to be the same for all elements that you add helper classes to. The reason for this is that the helper class's code is written with the M sizing component. If you don't know what M's are, simply put 1M is equal to the default font size in pixels of the element that you are selecting. Instead of going in more detail, I'm going to leave a link in the description to an article that explains what M's are, so if you don't know, go check that out. Each spacing size doubles by 2. Just keep in mind that medium will be double the size of small, and large will be double the size of medium. If you want to be more specific with your spacing, you're going to have to enter your own CSS into the style box. Now, we got all the information for this graph from the knowledge base on ThemeCode's website, so if you'd like to view theirs, go check that out with the link I've got at the top. Otherwise, we're going to have this graph here on our website. So this may seem like a lot of classes to remember, but there's a little bit of a trick to getting them down. I've found that these classes are extremely easy to remember just by thinking about what you want to change, where you want to change it, and by how much. So I'm going to give a little example of this. You can see the G on padding right here is being cut off by the border on the bottom. Now to fix that, all I have to do is add a padding all small to the element, and that'll add a little bit of padding between the text and the border and keep it from getting cut off. Now say I want to create some distance between the top margin there and my actual created CTA element. What I would do for that is add a margin. So I'm going to add a margin all large to that to space that up a little bit. Now for a little refresher, the difference between margin and padding is the distance between the insides of the element and the actual border, versus margin is the distance between the outer border of the element and other elements. Xtheme also has 9 helper classes for your font's weight. If you don't know what font weight is, that's essentially the thickness of your font, 100 being the lightest, 900 being the boldest. The helper classes are accessed with the code W-100 through W-900. Just remember that font weight 700 is the equivalent of bold, and font weight 400 is the equivalent of normal. Also keep in mind that depending on your font family, you won't have access to a lot of these weights. I'd recommend looking up your font family in either the Google Fonts library or Typekit's library, or just simply Google the font family that you're using and figure out the weights that you have access to. Most fonts do not have access to all of the font weights. The best way to understand helper classes is to see the CSS that each helper class outputs. The text on the left is the actual helper class, and the text on the right is the CSS that each one outputs. Keep in mind when you're entering classes that you don't need the period that's on the left side. This is just for declaring the class inside of the actual code. The only thing you need to enter into Cornerstone is this little string right here, depending on which one you want to use, obviously. Keep in mind that these 4 classes are specific to text. Xtheme also includes a couple of classes for text transformation. In my opinion, the best way to show off the text transform helper classes is by showing them. So I'm going to start off with the class TT_lower. That stands for text transform. And I don't know if you saw, but that got rid of all the capital letters inside my block grid that I added the class to. Now if I use TT_upper, that will make everything uppercase, which is actually slightly obnoxious. So what if I just wanted to make the middle grid normal and then keep the other ones as uppercase? So to do that, I would just enter into the block grid item interface in the inspector, and that has an entire separate interface for adding class shortcodes. And what I'll type here is TT none, which will remove any text transforms that are higher on the style sheet than the specific element that I selected. There's also utility classes for hiding content. I don't know if you guys noticed, but inside of Cornerstone, only rows and sections have the little buttons that hide the element based on the size of the device viewing it. Because of this limitation, one of the most useful sets of classes that I found was the responsive helper classes. These allow you to make specific elements available or unavailable to specific devices. Before I knew about these, I had to duplicate entire sections in order to make things mobile friendly. You can see why these would be useful for quick mobile and other device optimization. For instance, I have a rather large image that I don't want to display on phones. All I have to do is add the x-hide-xs helper class, and that'll make only that specific image invisible on mobile devices. If you want to figure out the exact pixel sizes that these helper classes have control over, just click on the various device sizes inside of Cornerstone. Or we'll have this graph on our website if you want to look at that instead. There's also visibility classes that work regardless of the device's size viewing them. I find these to be particularly useful when I'm doing maintenance on pages that are already public. I'll just duplicate an element that I want to work on, and when I'm done working on it but I still want to save it, just make sure I add the hide helper class to it. This class changes the element's display to none, which will remove it both visually and from screen readers. The hidden element will have no effect on the page's layout. It'll disappear as if it wasn't ever there. The show helper class simply outputs the property display block to your element. This will make the element display as if it was an HTML block element. Some examples of this are divs, headers, paragraphs, footers, basically any item that takes up an entire block of a page and there will be a line break with it is probably a block element. To be honest, you won't find yourself using the show helper class very often, but you may use show every once in a while when you're trying to make an element that's by default hidden display. For example, a page's meta description. The class hidden is basically a more complicated or advanced version of the hide helper class. It adds the important tag to the display none, which will override any other displays that could have been on the element, as well as adding something that's similar to display none, visibility hidden. Use this one if hide isn't working on your element to make it disappear. The invisible helper class is unique in that it only has the visibility hidden CSS code attached to it, which will make the element disappear both visually and from screen readers, but the page will maintain the layout as if the element was still there. In case you aren't sure, screen readers are used by visually impaired people to read off text on web pages, as well as convert text into Braille. Now, since I don't have a screen reader, I can't really display the next one. This helper class makes elements invisible visually, but it will be picked up by screen readers, which allows you to leave notes specifically for people who aren't able to actually view your website. For some reason, this makes me just giddy. Yeah, I know I'm a little weird, but I mean, how many people can say their website is handicap accessible? We can also use the right and left helper classes, which will simply generate a CSS code that floats the element to the right or floats the element to the left. We also have access to the incredibly useful clearFix helper class, which we use by simply typing CF into the class box. This will clear any floats that were previously placed on the element. Now, explaining this code would take me a while, so instead of doing that, I'm going to leave a link in the description to an article that goes in detail on the whole thing. But you really don't need to look at that to understand what this helper class does. Just remember, CF clears the float. We can also use the classes center block and center list. Center block is best used for centering full width elements. Center list attaches the table property to your element's display. This is best used for centering lists inside of other elements. I did find a couple other miscellaneous helpful classes inside of the FTP files, one of them being the overflow-hidden helper class, which is best explained by this screenshot right here. However, as an Xtheme user, you'll probably never need this, because it turns out that all Xtheme stacks have a function that is built into the HTML and body tags that will get rid of any overflow that would have been on your elements. This is why you've never had to actually deal with this while working with Cornerstone. And just in case by some weird reason you do encounter an overflow issue, now you have the class for it. Now there's also a helper class for fixing the position of an element, and that is affix, A-F-F-I-X. Now if you don't know what that is, here's an example of it happening with a YouTube icon on my page. Basically, no matter where your viewport goes, an element with the fixed property on it will follow. A lot of times I see this being used on blogs with social sharing icons. They will scroll down the page with you as you go. That's an example of a fixed element. Now, just a word to the wise, every once in a while I notice with certain elements I need to actually type in the affix CSS into custom CSS rather than into the Cornerstone class box. This is only with certain elements, but it's definitely something to note. We can also use helper classes for opacity. However, using the transparent helper class is basically the same thing as using the invisible helper class. It changes the element's opacity to 0, making it not seen visually, but the page will still maintain layout as if it was still there. There's also the counterpart opacity class, which is called opaque, which I honestly have never used, simply because there's not a lot of elements that have a low starting opacity, and this class does not work on a child element. And what I mean by that is if you attach the class transparent to an entire section, you cannot change the opacity of any element inside of that section. This includes everything from rows to Cornerstone elements. This is just something to keep in mind when you're dealing with the opacity property. I just want to mention that there is a couple of classes that we don't cover in this video, but we will have them in a future video as well as on our website. We'll also have all the graphs that you saw in this video on our website as well. I'll have a link for that in the description. Please subscribe for more. We've got Cornerstone videos coming up. We just had to cover our bases with this one first. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.